So, David, thank you so much for making the time. I want to start with some recent developments as it relates to ECOWAS. The regional blocs leaders have said they have troops on standby deployment as it relates to the issue in Niger. What does that mean, and what can it look like in the coming weeks?
Well, ECOWAS made a decision, during its most recent extraordinary session. There were three things which were quite critical. First of all, it ordered for the activation of the ECOWAS standby force, and then it, talked about deployment of the ECOWAS forces to restore constitutional order. But then clearly in that same statement, ECOWAS said that it would prioritize dialogue. Now, what that effectively means is that ECOWAS prefers to dialogue, but at the same time they are ready to restore constitutional order. And what does that actually mean in sense that ECOWAS wants to reinstate President Bazoum and have the constitution restored in Niger. Now that means it's a clear declaration of war, which of course has complications and challenges. But the ECOWAS commission that is in charge of that comprises the chief of defense staff. They were supposed to have a meeting in Accra, in Ghana, to discuss the logistical, in terms of how many forces are required, who is going to contribute what amount of forces. But that meeting did not take place. It was postponed indefinitely. So it therefore means the military plan or the war plan that ECOWAS is supposed to initiate through the chief of defense staff has not happened. But we also know that there has been some backdoor channels through some northern leaders, the ulamas from the north. They've been able to have a one-on-one meeting with the Nigerian junta. They also, I think, met the Prime Minister Ali Lamine. And the good news, has been that the military junta is now open to have a dialogue. Remember that it turned down some of the ECOWAS envoys that were sent to kind of initiate a way forward plan. So now the military junta has expressed its readiness, to have a dialogue with ECOWAS. But it also makes, a very critical point that this dialogue is only going to deal with the sanctions. It did not speak about reinstating the president. It didn't speak about releasing the president from the hostage situation. And they haven't spoken about any issues regarding, giving back constitutional power to a civilian government. But we know that the military junta has already appointed 21 ministers. It has appointed about 8 regional governors, and it has appointed the prime minister. So more or less, they've they've placed the government in place. They now have a prime minister and all the members of the government. So challenging position for ECOWAS, right now. They don't know where to go, if this is going to be, a military intervention, or they should continue to pursue the road of a dialogue. But we encourage that, dialogue should be the way forward.
And as you noted, the two sides are coming to the table with very different topics of conversation. Even, the ECOWAS leaders are talking about reinstating President Bazoum, and the leaders in Niger are talking about getting rid of the sanctions that ECOWAS has applied since the coup. So what does coming to some sort of agreement look like, or what can it look like? Or is this just, kicking the can down the road?
Both sides do have a critical challenge. For ECOWAS, there is no popular appetite. From where I'm, I've spoken to people in Nigeria where I am. The Nigerian Senate, for example, has not given its authorization for a military intervention, which the government needs. There has been 7 state governors, who share boundary with Niger. They've opposed any military intervention. The Islamic rulers have advised for talks, not war. The population doesn't have the appetite, and that's just Nigeria. We also know that out of the 15 member states, 5 of those member states will not be part of that ECOWAS standby force, including Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, and countries like Ghana, Togo, the Gambia, and Liberia have also expressed some reservations. Now, Niger, is strategically placed. It shares borders with Libya. It shares borders with Algeria as well. These two countries are quite critical, because of course they are not members of the ECOWAS, but including Chad. And I think ECOWAS finds it very difficult, to go to any military intervention without the backing of these states. So right now, it's a difficult one. ECOWAS believes that perhaps this is their last card. They've got to deter military rulers from carrying out coups, and the only way to do that is to apply some kind of a hard measure. But how do you practically carry out an intervention when you're not even sure of if the mission is going to be achieved? The military junta has made it very clear that in any event of an intervention, the life of former President Bazoum, who was deposed, could be at risk, and that of his family. So it's a very difficult position, for ECOWAS. On the other side, the military junta has been able to consolidate power within Niger. They have been able to raise, an anti-colonialist protest. They've also raised, a lot of significant protest against ECOWAS for any potential intervention. So they have consolidated power, in terms of buying the hearts and minds of Nigerians. But also they've made sure that they are moving on. They've appointed a transitional government. I think what we'll see possibly in the next coming days or so would be a timetable that the junta would bring up and say we're having elections in 6 months or a year. And that effectively kills any plans that ECOWAS would have, for a military intervention.
And ECOWAS has militarily intervened before in countries like Liberia and several of these countries in the Sahel that are actually behind Niger at the moment. What is the difference between the capacity that ECOWAS had back then, say in the 90s and the early 2000s, and what capacity the group has now, and what kind of support that it does or doesn't enjoy for something like a military intervention?
In terms of capacity, I think ECOWAS members do have the capacity, despite the segmentation, the division between some members saying they will not participate and others. For example, Nigeria has the capacity to deploy forces to Niger. Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire has said the same. Senegal is also ready to deploy forces. Benin Republic. So ECOWAS does have the military capacity, or what you call the military might. Now, look at the previous interventions, in Liberia, which you mentioned, in Sierra Leone. They also carried out intervention in Cote d'Ivoire. They carried out, the latest intervention was in 2017 in the Gambia, which was to remove, the former president, Yahya Jammeh, for refusing to concede. Now, these were quite happening under different circumstances. It's not the same. For one, in the case of countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone, there was some huge popular support. They wanted ECOWAS to come in. The population, was very happy to have ECOMOG, which was called at the time, to play a role. They also had the backing of some, military and security agencies, that acted as the front supporting, forces. In the case of the Gambia, the population and part of the population was quite pleased to have ECOWAS. Some of the military, especially the Gambian army, stood down and did not try and counter the ECOWAS, the forces that were deployed. So quite different. In the case of Niger, you have a population that sees this as an anti-colonialist movement. They accuse ECOWAS of being a puppet. They think that President Bazoum himself was a puppet to the French. So that rhetoric, has been used very, tactfully by the military junta to garner the support of the population. So ECOWAS doesn't have that support like it did in other countries. It doesn't have any security agency to work with. So literally, it would be ECOWAS carrying out what I see more or less, a conventional warfare. But that again, you can have the timetable to go in, but you may never know if you're going to achieve your mission or when this is going to end. So it's very different. The atmospheres and the conditions under which ECOWAS is going to intervene. Niger is one of the biggest countries in terms of land mass, even bigger than Nigeria. It's not the same like Sierra Leone or Liberia or even Cote d'Ivoire or the Gambia. So it's a different ball game. You need more forces. You don't even know what the enemy is going to throw at you. They can react. They can throw bombs back into your country. They can have a coalition from Russia. They can have a coalition, as has been promised, from Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea. So it's a different ballgame altogether, and that is why it has to be carefully thought of. I don't even think it's, it should be an option for ECOWAS because, the uncertainties are greater than, the predictabilities of this war.
And what about Russia? What do we know about the role that Russia may be playing in all of this?
I don't think Russia is playing a big role. I mean, there's been, since independence of most of the African countries in the 60s, there's been more than 115 military coups, not to talk about the failed coups in the continent. But most of these coups, Russia had no hand in them. What we have seen recently in the past 5 or 6 years, especially from Central African Republic to Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and now Niger, is that Russia has been taking advantage of the anti-colonial movement, the anti-French rhetorics, and they've been pickpocketing the French using Wagner forces. Now, in most of the cases that we've seen, Russia has not, deliberately been, I mean, even the United States said it that there is no evidence that Russia was behind the coup in Niger. They haven't been accused for causing this coup, but they have benefited from it. And what Russia keeps doing is that, wherever there is a chaos, wherever there is a coup, it will benefit from it. We've seen the situation with Niger, where the Wagner boss, Yevgeny Prigozhin, made it very clear that this was an anti-colonial war. I mean, in reference to that, they're simply saying, we are there to help you. So there is one thing with, planning a coup, executing a coup, and there's another thing with benefiting from it. What I see as the role of Russia is that Russia is ready to pounce, at every vulnerability where, Western powers are involved. It uses that rhetoric to take control, and it does that through its Wagner forces. That's what the situation is. And that's what makes this war, or any idea that the military intervention could simply be, a replay of what we're seeing in Ukraine, where there could be a proxy war going on in Niger between, countries that maybe are pro-Russia and countries that are pro-West. Because effectively, the United States has made it very clear, the EU, the French, that they will support ECOWAS if ECOWAS decides to intervene. And Russia has also made it clear that it does not support a military intervention. So it's another Ukraine that we could see. But I hope that, the military option, is sidelined in favor of dialogue and negotiations.
Given the anti-colonial sentiment, and as you mentioned, France, through its foreign minister, essentially supported ECOWAS going through with some sort of military intervention. Is there something else, or is there another approach that the U.S. or France should be taking in order to maybe, re-winning the hearts of the people on the ground, or trying to work with the political or military leaders that are now in power? Is there another approach to this than they have been taking so far?
I think effectively what we've seen is that the French brand, has been very toxic. After years of colonial maneuvering, the French have been accused, and even the French government has apologized, for some of the atrocities that it carried out in its former colonies. And there's been a lot of call for the French government to pay reparations. So the French brand has been, kind of toxic. We've seen they were driven away from Mali, Burkina Faso, and now they've been driven away from Niger. So I don't know what, I think what the French needs to do now is to kind of reevaluate their relationship. This is a new generation of Africans. They want to do business, on a win to win by win, and you win, I win basis. It's more or less. They don't want to go back to a system where they're being subjugated to the French imperialism. So it's going to be a difficult one. I think the Elysee Palace, has to look into this, and other Western countries that alongside, for example, the United States, that has a significant interest in Niger with drone bases there. Germany has a significant interest. Other Western countries, China has an interest. They've got to be able to perhaps try and as much as possible to rebrand themselves, because the whole idea that they are exploiting these former French colonies it's now a reality. Niger Republic has a lot of uranium. There is an existing gas pipeline project, which is about 4,000 kilometers starting from Nigeria through Niger to Algeria and then to Europe. This was meant to, or it is meant to kind of counter what Europe has said is the weaponization of gas by Russia. So the France, needs to reevaluate its position. It has a toxic brand. Nobody wants to. I mean, the population don't want to listen to France. So this is the time for them to, rebrand themselves. If not, I believe that this is the last we will see, of France in the Sahel, and any other country that is associated with France, will also catch that virus.
David Otto, thank you so much for your insight. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.